Welcome everyone to today's webinar, the U.S. Department of Labor under the Biden administration, presented by Barclay Damon. Many thanks to our presenter, Michael Schiotti, for being with us today and all of our participants who have joined in. We'd also like to thank our educational series sponsor, Chemung Canal Trust Company. Please note this webinar is being recorded to share what we learn with the business community. We will share the link with everyone later today. Michael will share his presentation with you, then we'll follow with time for questions and discussion. Please use the chat to submit questions during the presentation. And just a reminder, when others are speaking, to keep your audio on mute. With that said, I'll turn things over to Michael to start things off.
Great. Good morning. We have seen a very busy week from the U.S. Department of Labor. This presentation was prepared prior to OSHA releasing its guidance relative to the mandatory vaccine. I'll talk a little bit about it. You will be getting an email blast for scheduling a 2-hour webinar for November 19th at 10 o'clock to review the OSHA regulations for employers that have more than 100 employees. I finished my PowerPoint late last night, and it's well over 200 slides. They packed a lot into that. So we are going to touch on that today. I'll tell you a little bit about it, but we're going to need a full 2 hours in that regard. The good news is we're going to touch on some things today, such as disability accommodations and religious accommodations that are mentioned in the new emergency temporary standard, but are not explained in depth in that regard. None of this should surprise you. When a Democrat president is in power, the USDOL moves a little more pro-employee, and when the Republican is in charge of the executive, they move a little closer to the employer. And when we see switches in administration, we see switches in enforcement positions, changes in regulations, and things like that. And that is really one of the things that we are seeing under the Biden administration. But again, very typical of what we see when there's ever a change of political party in the executive branch. So don't presume I'm taking any political shots. I'm not. I'm simply pointing out that the philosophy changes. And as a result of philosophy changing, you as employers need to be more on guard, need to probably be more in compliance. They're not going to be as forgiving when it comes to penalties. They're going to be asking for liquidated damages, which are double awards. So just keep those things in mind and try to get compliance to the forefront, because where you may have got a break under the Trump administration, you're not going to get that break under the Biden administration. I've already seen it on some audits and things along those lines. So just get your house in order. This is a good time, especially if you have over 100 employees. I strongly encourage you to sit in that webinar next week. It is going to be packed full of information and goodies that you need to know, including implementing workplace policies that must be in writing and must be incorporated into your employee handbook. Okay, I always put my contact information up here. If you think of a question later on and you want to ask it, feel free to reach out to me, as long as it's not a 20-minute hypothetical, which isn't a hypothetical. I always think it's not fair if you're watching a presentation and then you think of a question later on and you can't reach out to me. You're free to. You're also free to follow me on Twitter and LinkedIn. Twitter, you can just follow me. LinkedIn, I will let you into the network. We post goodies pretty much every day and things you need to know. So the agenda today is as follows. We're going to talk a little bit about the Secretary of the United States Department of Labor. Who is he? What is his philosophy? He's very progressive. Former mayor of Boston, and I'll give you some more information about it. But that's who they picked to chair the U.S. Department of Labor. And it's really just a sign of the philosophy that it's going to move more pro-employee. We'll talk a little bit about the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 from earlier this year. The COVID-19 vaccine mandate is on everyone's mind. We will talk a little bit about it, but as I indicated, these slides were prepared before last, I think Thursday or Friday, whenever the standard was released, and we will we'll go through that in depth next Friday for about 2 hours to get through that. But I am going to talk generally about it. We will talk about disability and religious accommodations, which I really won't be talking about next week for lack of time. So it's good you're here, because that's sort of this part of the presentation will go hand in hand with that. There's been changes to the joint employer rule. The Trump administration made it more pro-employer and less difficult to establish a joint employer relationship. The Biden administration has reversed course in that regard to make it back to the old standard where it was easier to establish joint employer relationship. We'll also talk about, changes in independent contractor status. The Trump administration believed in the independent contractor status. We're in the state of New York. The state of New York pretty much does not believe in the concept of an independent contractor. As you're seeing in some of the new labor laws that are being rolled out here in New York State, they are using the term employee to include independent contractors now on some of the new laws that they're rolling out. So lastly, we'll review some of these other changes and sort of give you an idea. You got to comply with both federal law and state law. Where should I look? What one is more important to me? Which one is more restrictive? Because you have to always give the employee the greatest set of rights. So we'll just talk about that generally. This presentation, 30 to 45 minutes. It's not a long one, but it at least it's sort of setting the stage nicely for next week. So the Secretary of Labor is Martin J. Walsh. The former mayor of Boston, and what you need to know is that he's going to be pro-employee. The policies that we are seeing, from fines to requesting liquidated damage, and for those of you that don't know what a liquidated damage is, in essence, like if they do a wage audit of you and they determine that you owe $10,000 in wages, they're not sending you a bill for $10,000, folks. They're sending you a bill for $20,000. They're doubling it. They're going to be less forgiving on the question of liquidated damages and more likely to request a double award during this administration. That's just the reality of it. That's how it was under the Obama administration. Got a little more flexible under the Trump administration. Now we're going to go back to really the Obama administration's philosophy. But again, nothing earth-shattering. None of that surprises me as an employment practitioner, and none of it should surprise you as either owners, HR professionals, or if you're in payroll. He is. This is a little bit from his bio in that regard. From the Department of Labor, again, nothing earth-shattering other than he is going to be more pro-employee than the prior administration. So the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, one of the things we saw in the labor employment front due to the pandemic is a continuation of some things that we saw under the Trump administration. Unemployment insurance extension, which ran out September 6th. And interesting, many employers were thinking after September 6th, their lack of workers would be solved. And surprisingly, we're seeing that is not the case, that the mass influx of employees back into the workplace has not necessarily followed. Some are still staying out. So that extra federal pandemic unemployment compensation ran out on September 6th of this year. And the pandemic emergency unemployment compensation was extended to 53 weeks from 24 weeks under the law. The Family First Coronavirus Response Act, which I've talked in depth about on multiple webinars in 2020 for the chamber. The tax credits were extended through September 30th. One thing to be aware of, if you're audited by the IRS, you're going to have to prove that the employee was eligible for Family First Coronavirus Response Act leave. And if the employee was not, those tax credits will be charged back and you won't be entitled to them. So make sure you have your paperwork in order to the extent that you were covered by and followed Family First Coronavirus Response Act and have taken advantage of the tax credits, which now have ended. We've also saw the new Cobra Rules that were rolled out in that regard. Again, just more pro-employee, taking into consideration the reality of the pandemic, the reality of the workplace, in that regard. So those were also rolled out, but again, just part and parcel of the philosophy that we're seeing. COVID-19, as we approach entering our third year, calendar year of COVID-19, continues to be a hot button item. We did not reach herd immunity voluntarily. There was a group of individuals who are refusing the vaccination for whatever reason. I'm not judging anyone. We saw here in New York the healthcare workers and that being imposed upon them. We are seeing at the federal level COVID-19 vaccine mandates, which I'm going to review what those are right now. It sort of is a lead into next Friday when we review, what is that OSHA standard and where does it stand currently. I can tell you where it stands as of today. It's currently on hold due to a nationwide injunction. I'm not sure it's going to last in that regard, and I think it's going to get to the U.S. Supreme Court sooner rather than later. The decision that granted the injunction against the Department of Labor and OSHA, there's nothing to it, folks. I mean, it's a one-liner. It basically says there are serious constitutional questions. That's it. It doesn't say more than that, but we'll see in that regard. And Texas is the same appellate court and jurisdiction that put on hold years ago the change in the overtime regulations and caused a hue and a cry for employers who are trying to get ready for that in that regard. And I'm not quite sure where this is going, but we will review the OSHA standard. Believe it or not, I actually think it makes some sense in that regard. I think once the litigation subsides on the over 100 employees, I think the government's going to turn to employers with less than 100 employees in that regard as a means to trying to get herd immunity and what have you. At the federal level, we have 3 separate initiatives that the White House has announced. First, federal employees are going to be required to be vaccinated, along with healthcare workers here in New York. Not so much of a surprise because we're a little bit ahead of the game. Employees have lost their jobs as a result of this. Many employers that let employees go quickly discovered that those employees, about 80% of them, went and got vaccinated and came back. Those are some practical numbers that my clients have told me. They may have fired 100, but the next couple of days, 80 of them came back to work and with their vaccine card in that regard. And some of them were saying, I didn't think you'd actually do it. They did. And then lastly, the new Osha standard that was rolled out last Friday, covering employers with over 100 employees. Man, this sucker is packed full of goodies, to be very honest with you. I was working on the PowerPoint last night, and I exceeded 200 slides, and I said, I have to stop. I mean, there's some stuff I intentionally left out. The good news for you as an employer, if you have over 100, is currently that there is a stay in effect. We believe it is a nationwide stay in that regard. The court's decision doesn't come out and say that. The reason we're saying that is because there's a provision in the OSHA Act that basically implies that is what it is. So we'll see. But let's talk a little bit more in that regard. So President Biden signed an executive order requiring that basically unvaccinated federal workers be vaccinated in that regard. And I've heard many reasons why people don't want to get vaccinated in that regard. Really, the two that you as an employer are going to have to focus on are religious exemptions and disability-based exemptions. I have seen a few disability-based accommodation / exemptions. I don't think there's a difference between an exemption or an accommodation. So I think those terms are interchangeable. Individuals with certain allergies, there is some evidence that they should not receive the COVID-19 vaccination because it could make things worse for them. That is the only medical condition that I have seen so far. There may be others out there. I'm not saying there is. The religious one is more troubling and more difficult. We're going to walk you through in a second the state human rights law religious accommodation test in that regard. There were churches that were quickly formed. The church of the anti-vaxxers. It's a real church. It's a real recognized religion. Is it made up or is it sincerely held? Well, I guess that is the question. In order for you as an employer to grant a religious accommodation, it's going to have to be sincerely held. And we'll talk about that a little bit. So the first of the three, the first part of President Biden's triangle is the mandatory vaccination of federal workers, and that the standard is extended to employees of federal contractors doing business with the federal government. Here, the devil is in the details of the executive order. It's basically all contracts in the future that are entered into, and anytime a contract is updated in that regard. As part of this effort, we got the Department of Defense, the Department of Veterans Affairs, Indian Health Service, and the National Institute of Health will complete implementation of the requirement in that they believe it's going to cover 2.5 million people. We have a healthcare worker mandate at the federal level. That guidance was also rolled out last week. I have started with the OSHA one. I have not drilled down to this to this one yet. I think this is of secondary importance in the healthcare industry. I think first and foremost, you had to comply with New York. They're a little ahead of it, and I'm not sure it matches up exactly. So it's going to apply to most healthcare settings that receive Medicare or Medicaid reimbursement. It includes hospitals, dialysis facilities, ambulatory surgical settings, and home health agencies in that regard. It's going to apply to nursing home staff as well as staff in hospitals and other CMS regulated settings, including clinical staff, individuals providing services under arrangements, volunteers, and staff who are not involved in direct patient care, resident, or client care. And I think what you're seeing is that even if you're not in the healthcare industry per se, hospitals are mandating that their contractors comply with the same same standards that they are being held to in that regard. So it's already being pushed on private sector employers because they are a vendor or a contractor to a hospital in that regard, and you may be seeing it. I think many of my employers welcomed the Osha standard because they wanted to do it. They were just looking for some political cover, and now they have it. And then there's another group that didn't care, and they were already doing it anyways in that regard. They believe the health care worker standard will reach 50,000 providers across the country in that regard. So that's going to reach a lot of people and hopefully have the impact of reducing COVID overall. Okay, so the private sector. What we received last Friday was an emergency temporary standard that OSHA issued. I think it's effective November 5 in the last week. Immediately, the state of Texas and some private entities requested what is called an injunction. That injunction was issued. The court that issued the injunction covers Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. So what does that mean for New York? It's not 100% clear, but we believe that that injunction is a nationwide injunction, which prohibits OSHA from enforcing their emergency temporary standard until there is a hearing on it and a further briefing. Is that 100% guaranteed? No, it is not. I think you need to get ready. I think you need to get in compliance. And many of you are already doing so in that regard. As I indicated earlier, my PowerPoint on this emergency temporary standard is in excess of 200 pages or 200 slides. But let me just sort of, you have to have a vaccine mandate or you can test out once every 7 days and basically wear PPE. They're very specific as to what the PPE is and engage in social distancing and other items. OSHA has provided us with, there's going to be a lot that will have to be added to the employee handbook. They have provided us with model templates, which I will review and distribute next week as well. But that is the sum and substance of it. I think it's on hold, but again, that could change with a court action today, tomorrow, or in a week. They believe that this standard will reach 80 million workers. And there is religious accommodations, there is disability accommodations under it. There is this preemption issue that we're trying to deal with as well. OSHA takes the position that this standard preempts state rules that are inconsistent in that regard. And I think what they were getting at is there are some states which you've all been reading and hearing about in the South that say we're forbidding employers from mandating the vaccine in that regard. And if you do, we're going to fine you. That is an issue that we're seeing in the South, in Florida and Texas and other places. So what OSHA tried to do, and whether it will ultimately work or not, is say that law is preempted by this regulation and cannot be enforced because this regulation, this emergency temporary standard, is what is going to apply. Ultimately, the courts are going to rule on that, but practically speaking, When we go over the standard next week, we'll give you a lot of practical advice of what you have to do as an employer to comply. The reality is you're going to have a mandatory COVID-19 policy. The Department of Labor has prepared a couple different versions for us. If you want to wait and see, whether what goes down on OSHA, I think many employers have been developing their own COVID-19 policies. Some policy considerations, who's covered? All your employees, pockets of your employees, new hires, independent contractors, others such as vendors and third parties entering the workplace. These are just things I want you to consider. What date by which the vaccine must be received? There are union considerations. If you have a union, certain factors are going to need to be negotiated with the union. If you don't have a union, do I have to worry? Yeah, you do. We are seeing some employers experience union campaigns because their workers are running to unions, asking for assistance to help fight against an employer mandate for a COVID-19 vaccine. Just something to keep in mind. Can I do incentives for employees to take the COVID-19 vaccine? I'll give you $1,000. Yeah, I think you can in that regard. Make sure your incentives are clear, what the incentives are and what the triggers are for them. And again, we have the accommodation process that we must run through religious and disability. In the past, we have had a disability accommodation webinar that we did for the chamber. That is something I would encourage you to go back and take a look at. None of the rules have really changed in that regard. New York State has a vaccine leave law. You're going to see a vaccine leave in the Osha standard, giving people time to recover if they get sick after the shot. I got my booster on Monday afternoon. I was totally useless, going to do a thing. That's recovery time. When the employee gets sick or a headache afterwards, that is going to be covered by the new OSHA standard. And refusal to obtain the COVID-19 vaccine. It's a two-step process before I can fire an employee. First, I exclude the employee from the workplace, and then I can terminate as long as it's legal under all other employment laws. We are seeing religious accommodations saying the vaccine is against my religion. We're also seeing this, the test to determine whether I have COVID is against my religion. I haven't seen that at all in any religion coming out in saying that. What I would call mainstream religions, and I don't mean to ever insult anyone, but there are mainstream religions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism. Those are what I call mainstream religions. What's not a mainstream religion? Here in New York State, Jediism, Star Wars is a recognized religion. The Church of the First Cannabis, the Church of the Anti-Vaxxers, the pasta, like pasta eat, pastafarians. Those are all religions, but they're not mainstream. And you can't dismiss those religions. Oh, my favorite, vampirism, is also a recognized religion here in New York. And you have to accommodate their sincerely held religious beliefs. So we'll talk about that in a second. You are going to have to track under the regulations the vaccination status of all your employees. And I would tell you, if you have below 100, I believe you also have this obligation as part of a disability and religious accommodation. The EEOC has specifically said, the number of employees who are vaccinated versus the number of employees who are not vaccinated is a consideration in the reasonable accommodation process for both disability and religion. And as a result of that, I think you have to track it. So the OSHA regs are going to require that you track the main shots, one for Johnson & Johnson, two for Moderna or Pfizer. Interesting, there is no tracking required for the booster in that regard. I think it's a good idea to track it. And we'll tell you what is good proof in that regard. So questions to ask your employees: what type of vaccine? What was the date of your first dose? What was the date of your second dose, if applicable? What was the date of your booster, if applicable? Request a copy of the vaccine card. Here in New York, we have an app on your smartphone called the Excelsior Pass Plus. That, in my opinion, is the only 100% way to know that that vaccine card is legitimate. We have seen individuals selling the vaccine cards, both on the internet and not on the internet. That is a problem, but you can require employees to get this Excelsior app. And what it does is it asks you a series of questions. What was the date you got your vaccine? Did you get it in? And they'll give you a list, 4 places, and you got to pick where you got it. What was the date of your second vaccine and where did you get it? They'll ask you these questions, and then they will download the pass that shows you're legal. So you take the card plus the pass that's on the smartphone, you have 100% proof that they are in fact fully vaccinated. If an employer requires vaccinations when they're available, how should it respond to an employee who indicates that he or she is unable to receive COVID-19 because of sincerely held religious belief? Just like you would any other religious accommodation question. You are generally what they would like to do is that you assume it is accurate unless you have reason to disbelieve it. And you must provide the reasonable accommodation unless it creates an undue hardship in that regard. That is the federal rule. The federal rule defines undue hardship as having more than a de minimis cost or burden on the employee. I don't find the federal test to be very helpful in that regard. The EEOC would like you to assume the request is legitimate unless you have reason to question it. I have tried a sincerely held religious belief case before. You know, one of the things that the jury looked at in that case is we had a gentleman who was going with the holidays. So at Ramadan, just so happened he was Islam. Yom Kippur, he thought he was Jewish, and at Christmas, well, of course, he's a Christian, and that was one of the main reasons the case went to trial, is because of this fluctuating religious belief. But that was a reason to question. If an employee requests a religious accommodation and you have some objective basis for questioning the religious nature or sincerity, you're justified in supporting additional documentation. So we are seeing requests. I'm Christian, and they cite some scripture, and they basically say, therefore, I have a religious accommodation. We fire back with questions. What particular faith? Are you Roman Catholic? Are you Lutheran? Are you Baptist? And what I actually have is a list of guidance from each of those religions. None of them are objecting to the vaccine on religious grounds. Even the Pope says, go get vaccinated in that regard. I told you I don't think the federal COVID religious accommodation is too helpful. But the undue hardship test under New York state law is, and these are the factors you'll have to consider, whether you grant or don't grant the accommodation, assuming it's sincerely held. What is the workplace? What is the nature of the employee's duties? What is the cost relative to the size of the budget? What is the effect of the religious accommodation on your business? Do you have any collective bargaining agreements or seniority systems that are already established, which you're simply following? How many people need the accommodation? If you have 150 employees, 149 need the accommodation, guess what? They're all not getting it at the end of the day. What is the impact, if any, on workplace safety? And does the proposed accommodation conflict with other laws, or is it simply illegal in that regard? Under the New York sort of walks us through the religious accommodation question a little bit more. The religious accommodation law protects all aspects of an individual's religious practice and observance, even if it is not required by the religion. This is the problem area here in New York for employers. An employee must notify the employer of the need for an accommodation and give them a sufficient period of time to respond. So Friday at 4 o'clock, the employee says, I have a sincerely held religious belief. I can't work on Saturday, but they've known about it for 3 weeks. I can deny that request and make them work on Saturday. Why? They didn't give me enough time to respond or make any inquiries. Both state law requires that the employer and employee should work together to find an accommodation. That is the same under federal law. And you are allowed to ask questions to evaluate the sincerity. So the Church of the Anti-Vaxxers, when did you join the church? Why did you join the church? What are the beliefs? What are your practices? And, we ask questions of them, and a lot of times they don't respond. And if they don't respond, you can deny the religious accommodation. You're not required to grant the specific accommodation that the employee requests. You are required to grant an accommodation that meets the employee's religious needs in that regard. So if you have two accommodations, one the employee wants, one the employer wants, and they both work, the employer gets to pick. That's the same rule in the disability arena. If I deny a religious accommodation, if I deny a disability-based accommodation, what happens? As I've explained, it's a two-step process. First, we exclude from the workplace. If they can do their job at home, no harm, no foul, and we let them work from home. But if they can't do their job from home, let's say they are an automobile repair person, and they must be at the garage to repair the cars, and I can't accommodate them. The second part is I will evaluate, can I terminate them? Before you go down the termination process, what we're recommending is that as a reasonable accommodation, you give them some unpaid leave. We're going to give you 2 weeks of unpaid leave to think about your request. Then we're going to fire you. That seems to get some people's attention. So think about in those 2 weeks whether you want to get the vaccine or not. Otherwise, we are going to, in fact, terminate. Termination is not automatic. You must review all the employees' rights under federal, state, and local law to determine, can I, in fact, terminate them? For instance, if they have a union and the collective bargaining agreement says you can only terminate under these ways, you might not be able to terminate the employee, and you may have to work with the union to find a solution. Another thing the Department of Labor has changed is the joint employer rule. They rescinded the Trump administration's joint employment standard, which made it easier for businesses to operate independently if they had the same owner, they operated out of the same building. Under the Biden administrations, those, even if they're separate employee identification numbers, they all operate out of the same building. They all have the same owners. They're going to be looked at as a single employer in that regard. So it's going to be a more difficult standard for you as an employer, and you're going to have to comply with more things. So I've sort of explained that the concept. Some other changes that we're seeing. The tip rules, some parts were delayed until 12/31. I think they just rolled out part of it the other day. Some parts of the tip rule went into effect on April 30th of this year. Please remember, if you're dealing with tipped employees, you must comply with the New York State Department of Labor Hospitality minimum wage order. Most of that is going to control over the federal tip rule at the end of the day. So I put in here some more information on the tip rule in case you're interested on that. The independent contractor standard that the Trump administration adopted, which basically said, hey, it's possible that someone who works for you as an independent contractor is really an independent contractor and not an employee. That standard has been reversed. We've returned to the old standard, which the economic realities test of who an employee is, very broad in that regard. Word of thumb here is if you have independent contractors, you really need to assess if they're really employees. I want to be an independent contractor. So what? This is their second job. So what? Those are not defenses to the person is really an employee. And something to keep in mind, the employee can challenge their status or the government can challenge their status. Even if the employee signed an independent contractor agreement, they can still challenge their status as an independent contractor. How does this come up? It comes up on audits by the government. They're going to ask to look at your 1099s. It can also come up if your independent contractor is dismissed, suddenly they apply for unemployment. And your response is, they're not entitled to unemployment. He's an independent contractor. Well, you're going to have to fight it out in the Unemployment Insurance Appeal Board, which is very hostile to the concept of an independent contractor. It also comes up is if your independent contractor slips and falls down a flight of stairs and breaks his or her leg. What are they going to do? Well, they're not covered by my workers' comp because they're not an employee. They're going to file for workers' comp, and guess what? They're going to get it unless they had their own workers' compensation coverage, because your policy is probably written in such a way that you're being charged for independent contractors and subcontractors unless you have a certificate of insurance from them showing that they have their own workers' compensation covered. So again, just some things to keep in mind. Here in New York, the return to the old federal standard, it's not going to have much impact on us. I didn't lose any sleep over it. And I didn't, when the Trump administration rolled out their independent contractor rule, I didn't go hooray, because I knew we were sitting here in New York where the rule is that hostile. And that's really what I wanted to tell you today. You're going to see this more progressive Department of Labor. It's going to be more pro-employee next week. And the chamber is going to be sending out the announcement. We will go over the Osha standard for employers over 100. It's very in-depth. It's going to probably take us a couple hours to go through everything and to answer your questions. So with that, I'm happy to entertain any questions. I haven't seen any pop up, but if you do have questions, you feel free to ask me right now, or if you don't want to, feel free to email me later and I will respond. So with that, does anyone have any questions? Got none, Candace.
All right, well, thank you for that presentation. And again, we will share the link with everyone from the recording later today. I'll also include the registration link for the webinar Michael mentioned, the OSHA mandatory COVID-19 vaccine guidance. That's again, Friday, November 19th at 10 a.m. And you can always visit chemungchamber.org to register for upcoming webinars or find recordings to previous webinars. So with all that said, I think we'll go ahead and close things out. Again, if any questions, feel free to reach Michael or the chamber and we'll get you in touch. But thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.